All right, hello everybody and welcome to this evening's event. My name is Ned Bowman. I am the outreach coordinator with the Great Basin Bird Observatory. We are a nonprofit research group based here in Reno, Nevada. And this is part of our winter lecture series tonight. We're going to be hosting these presentations more or less monthly, every couple of weeks throughout the winter. So I'm going to introduce Joe Barnes, our presenter, but before I turn it over to Joe, I want to plug a few upcoming events with the Great Basin Bird Observatory. So this Saturday on the 13th, we're hosting a gull identification workshop at the University of Nevada, Reno. We've got a classroom presentation. We can handle museum specimens and stuff. And then we're going to head out to Sparks Marina to look at gulls in the field. And those gull walks are going to continue monthly throughout the winter as well. There'll be another one in January, another one in February. And we are also still running our end of year fundraiser and accepting donations to support our outreach and education program. Our Giving Tuesday Adopt a Survey campaign is also still running. This year, donors can adopt a Nevada bird count survey transect by donating to it. The goal is to raise enough funds for each survey transect to cover the cost of sending a GBBO biologist to that location to conduct the survey the following breeding season. Once the survey is completed, all sponsors of that transect get a full species list, highlight photos, and a little blog written by the surveyor that conducted that survey. So you can find more info about these fundraisers and upcoming events at our website, www.gbbo.org. And then our next winter lecture series is on January 12th, where I'll be giving a presentation about the Nevada Bird Records Committee and all of the rare birds that have showed up in Nevada over the past year. So Joe Barnes, I'm really excited for our presentation tonight. It should be really interesting. He's been studying peregrine falcons for over 20 years in Nevada with several different agencies, including NDOW and Fish and Wildlife Service. 20 years ago, peregrine falcons were fairly scarce breeders in the state. At least we didn't know a whole lot about them and their distribution within the state. Since that time, a lot has changed with much thanks to Joe's research. We've learned a lot about their biology in the desert, and a lot to do with current conservation concerns. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ned. You took some of my intro, so I can chop that down a little bit. But yeah, so I am a migratory bird biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service right now. As Ned mentioned, I've been, it kind of blew my mind when I said I would give this talk because I looked at the year that I started and realized 22 years, wow. I'm not the whippersnapper I used to be, but I still try. But I want to shout out just right out the front end of things is that it's covered the gamut. I started out as a National Park Service employee down with Lake Mead National Recreation Area. Did my first 6 years up through 2010. Primarily, 90% of my work was with the Park Service then. Put in a lot of independent work after that for a handful of years before I started with as a biologist with Nevada Department of Wildlife with NDOW. Was with them for about 9 years, and now I'm here with as a federal biologist. So it's kind of covered a big spectrum. Worked with a lot of people, and I have a lot of people to thank. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Anyhow, yeah, so, but now before I launch in, I want to give you some backstory. You're all here to see a bird talk. You're theoretically birders, interested in birds. Peregrines are, a pretty fascinating species. I'm biased, but I want to share some of my passion, some of what I've learned about the species with you all. And hopefully that, you get a broader appreciation. When I agreed to give the talk, at first I thought, hey, I've got an hour, I'm going to go full bore and go comprehensive. And then I realized I have easily 4 hours that I could talk your ears off for. So this is a little condensed. I'm definitely going to get some detail for you, but it's a bit of more of a broad brushstroke to try to cover everything. But peregrines, they are this diurnal raptor, very territorial and aggressive. They primarily hunt other birds and bats, so focusing on other things that fly. And to do that well, you've got to be a very extremely fast, agile, quick. So peregrines, they're, one of their notable things is that they're the fastest animal on the planet. They've been clocked at engaging in stoops to 200 miles an hour. And so all of this is kind of important. It captures the public's imagination, but it kind of makes peregrines what they are. And it makes them fascinating to study. It also, that territorial dynamic, we're going to think about that when I start taking you through and looking at breeding population size, because the ability and the necessity to hold and maintain a territory is pretty critical when you try to get an understanding of how well they're doing. I do want to note that they are an environmental conservation success story. We don't get happy endings that often. It's not to say this is an ending by any means, and I am definitely going to get into some things that are a little bit ominous. But peregrines were, they were endangered. They were on the endangered species list for several years, from about 1970, I think, through 1999. But DDT was banned in 1972, and peregrines came back. So it is nice to see that you can have that type of success. But studying this type of species and maintaining a data set over a number of years is pretty critical to, again, just ensuring that they're still being successful and ensuring that you're still maintaining a happy and healthy population. Okay, so now getting into what we know about peregrines in Nevada. Sorry, maybe I can get rid of this. I'm not gonna, So this slide talks about some of the variability and effort, and it's true. I've had different priorities. I have had people help me, but an awful lot, especially the ground monitoring, is almost 100% my own. And so you can only do so much as one person. And so over the years, my workflow, my priorities have ebbed and flowed. Things have come and gone. And so not all years have we been able to get a comprehensive view, but I hopefully will give you a good snapshot of kind of what's going on there. But just to orient you, you're all familiar with Nevada. This red line that you see, kind of the polygon here, or sorry, kind of this jumbled line here. This is the transition. This is the boundary between Great Basin Desert and Mojave Desert. So everything south of this is Mojave Desert. North is the Great Basin. And then this little sliver out where we are is the Sierra Nevada ecoregion, which is, at least in this portion of Nevada, that's the Tahoe Basin. And then these, because they're territory holders, they, over time, and usually this manifests itself even when you lose members of a pair, a new member will come in and usually maintain the same space, the same area on the landscape. And so once you start filling in all these dots, and each one of these blue dots represents a known peregrine falcon nesting territory. Once you start filling that in, it's not to say it's easy, because they live in pretty wide open areas. It's hard to get to, but it's much easier than it normally would be when to maintain and be able to monitor them over time. Okay, in my first years, 2004 through 2010, the vast majority of that was at Lake Mead National Recreation Area. I started expanding, getting out into the Mojave Desert, and then up into the Great Basin around 2010 and onward. And then I moved up here to Reno about 7 years ago, and at that point, it was definitely a fully statewide perspective. So I think it's important now to take a quick step back and look at what was going on with peregrines historically, at least in our state. Peregrines, in my intro, I probably skipped it, but up until pretty recently, and still with a lot of folks in a lot of areas, peregrines are considered to need aquatic systems relatively nearby for successful breeding. Most of that probably has to do with prey availability and prey abundance. And that was the common perception. So the view even in the 1940s, prior to the DDT era, and then afterwards, the perception was they needed aquatic systems. Part of that was reinforced by then folks would go to near aquatic systems. And that means, going to shorelines, whether it's ocean, lakes, rivers, wetlands, meadows, things like that, wet meadows. Anywhere where you also had to have nesting substrate, so in most cases cliffs. But when you had cliffs nearby near to water systems, that's kind of where you find peregrines. So for the Great Basin, prior to the population collapse from the DDT era, there were really very, very few known and substantiated territories for the Great Basin anywhere, but certainly for Nevada. We only had 5 territories, which you see here in the blue dots. And that is important too in how things are playing out right now. They were all abandoned by the early to mid 1950s, most likely from DDT. They were considered extirpated as a breeding species in the state for about 30 years. Not until 1985 was the first pair picked up, and that was here just north of Hoover Dam on the shoreline of Lake Mead. And at that point, it's just outside of Las Vegas. So that basically brought the species in as a breeding population again for the state. I will say that territory, every single year that anybody's looked that I'm aware of, it's been occupied. So it's been continuously occupied for over 40 years now. So now reintroduction efforts were begun by Endow, 3 different locations that I'm aware of, 1 in Las Vegas and 2 along eastern Nevada. Only 1 was successful, and that was down in Vegas. There was 1 territory that was occupied at least through 2006, 2007. After that, I'm not really sure. I will admit, I love being out in the mountains and in the desert. I'm not privy to being in urban metropolitan areas and birding, so I haven't looked, and I don't know that anybody's really looked seriously since around 2007 or 8. From the early 1990s through 2003, the year before I came here, there was some limited monitoring. And I don't say that to be demeaning by any means. Most of that monitoring was occurring at Lake Mead. My mentor when I came into this was Ross Haley with the National Park Service. And him and his team was able to pick up a lot of these territories. But we had a grand total of 16 known territories, all located down in southern Nevada at that point. So that's the backstory before I arrived. I got on the scene, and again, we have those 16 territories. My mandate was kind of to go out in the park, down at Lake Mead, and find out what the overall breeding density is and get an idea for total population size. So I said, of course, sure, I'll do that. And so how do you get at that? Well, when I came into the scene, peregrines had been delisted since '99. There's a 4-hour post-delisting monitoring survey approach. And that was basically set up by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to ensure that we have standardized data collection across the board nationally, as well as then over time, over that 15-year period. So that was great. I mean, I spent easily hundreds of hours watching peregrines, or at least trying to find peregrines, watching for peregrines. But I quickly realized as I got more and more territories, and as I was just trying to cover more and more space, there was no way physically possible that I could use 4-hour monitoring approaches at all times. So I went to a call broadcast approach. And so I tried to boil down that 4-hour survey effort down to 10 minutes. And that's what I'm showing you here. So I did for 3 years, I ran a whole series of trials looking at time of year, period within the breedings. So breeding stage within the breeding season, keep moving that guy around. So like courtship, incubation, nestling, fledgling, and I even looked post-breeding, and this was actually October, November, December, a couple different years. So well outside of when you normally consider a peregrine to be territorial and aggressive. But even that, they responded about 50% of the time. So before you switch methodology, you want to really make sure that it's working and effective and it's getting the data you need it to give you. And that's what I'm showing you here, just one piece of that puzzle. But basically, what I first wanted to look at is make sure peregrines are responding. And so this first approach, you see sample sizes, which are at the bottom of each of these bars. So this is my first cut. I just wanted to know if I even had a hope of this working. So I would go out passively and spend anywhere from 5 minutes to 4 or maybe even 5 hours on territories that were previously known, verify that 1 or preferably 2 members of a breeding pair were on site, and then I would broadcast. Once I knew where they were, I had them in, I was able to monitor them, see exactly what they did, then I broadcasted a con-specific call. And the idea, again, is because they're territorial, that should raise up their hackles and elicit a response. So I wouldn't have to sit and wait for 4 hours. And the results were pretty impressive. Before I get into this though, I'm certainly not the first to come up with a call broadcast survey approach. I mean, this has been used for years for woodland species, things like goshawks, red-shouldered hawks, also nocturnal species, owls, a lot of owl species, folks use this approach, and even some of our songbirds, southwestern willow flycatchers. But it had never been used, and it's certainly never been tested and proven for peregrines. So it's a bit of going out on a limb, but I found hugely successful, especially during courtship, but even later in the game, pretty successful. And we would never, when you're going out and monitoring, you're never going to go out just one time. Before you can assess whether or not a territory is occupied or how well they're doing, you're going to at least do 1 or 2 different replicate surveys. And so what I found is, even if you're doing multiple surveys, you have a very high probability of picking them up, which was as successful, if actually not a little more successful than those 4-hour passive surveys. So yeah, went out, broadcasted, and it's just, I flooded the talk with photos, so hopefully you're not offended, but the idea is to pass on some of the passion. But yeah, they can be pretty photogenic and pretty excited at times, especially when you make them mad with the broadcast. So another method, and this was really critical too. So myself, but also a bunch of colleagues with NDOW, with Nevada Department of Wildlife, had started doing aerial surveys using helicopters, flying along potential cliff nesting substrate for the most part. These surveys, and that's what you see in this map here. All of these pink polygons, these kind of fuzzy, odd-shaped lines. These are all survey routes from 2006 through 2014. 15 was actually a test year. So this is 6 through 14. So you see the coverage that we hit across the state. I came in relatively late into that process, but I was able to leverage the data. So basically in the process, these surveys, again, they were not targeting peregrines, they were targeting raptors in general, but more specifically nests, because they were kind of fixed on the landscape, they don't move around. And once you develop nest inventories, it makes future surveying a whole lot easier. This is a picture of a golden eagle nest in the shadow of one of our helicopters on survey. And so those surveys, they're really designed to pick up those nests. A small peregrine may or may not get picked up. Even so, we got 21 new territories. Now, I think a handful of those were verified right off the bat when we had nest photos of a peregrine on eggs or with nestlings. The vast majority of those 21 new territories had to be followed up on the ground though. So we would go out either the year of or future years to go and pinpoint and make sure that indeed they're a territory holding pair. I wasn't content with that, because I didn't like the idea of just kind of resting blindly on the survey approach without knowing how effective it was. So in 2015, what I did is I selected 23 known territories down in the Lake Mead area. I verified occupancy on the ground on my own. And then I had a colleague, a friend of mine, biologist with NDOW, fly up blind. And they flew the area. He had no preconceived information about where territories were. He did know that he's looking for peregrines as well as other nests, using the exact same methodology that we used across the rest of the state. But had no idea where the nests were, where the territories were, or how many territories, anything of that nature. And what we found is 30% of those territories were detected. Now, we didn't have the time and the money and the resources to redo this, but in one year of effort, it's suggestive that we're getting about 30% or a third of the territories. So this was pretty good information, and especially when you're looking at a relatively small population size, it at least tells us that we're in the ballpark. It's a tool, and it's a helpful tool. There also is another piece which I cannot, this is pretty critical, but it's really hard to quantify. It's very hard to visualize on a map like this. But from the first year onward, I've always reached out and been amenable, just open to hearing from other biologists, folks with state, federal, county agencies, as well as environmental consultants, and just general, hikers and birders like you all. So anytime you get an observation, I'm happy to hear it. And this has been, the case for 22 years, especially for environmental consulting. I've had multiple folks, a couple in particular, that have been so valuable to this because they're out there surveying for, doing surveys in relation to mines or proposed solar or transmission lines. They're out in the exact same types of areas that we surveyed. They're also, in some cases, they're completely overlapping our survey areas, and in many other cases, they're surveying areas that we didn't survey, and they're feeding me information. In the process of adding in some of those opportunistic observations, I picked up an additional 6 territories. So that gives me a pretty good idea that actually, I do believe, you see there's not a whole lot of peregrines up here. I do believe we're actually in the ballpark. Most likely, we're certainly not capturing all of the peregrine territories out there, but I do believe we're most likely underestimating to some degree, but it's in the ballpark and it gives me a relatively, a happy feeling that we're, have a better understanding of what's going on with them. Now, again, territories in proximity to water. So this is a big thing. Peregrine researchers, raptor researchers in general, this was kind of their mantra for 50 years at least. And that's a little bit problematic when you look at Nevada, this driest state in the nation. Where are they going to nest? And so this, I'm just showing you some representative data. Initially, I broke it down by ecoregion. Again, Mojave Desert, Great Basin Desert, Tahoe Basin. Just think of that original map with those red lines. And then your sample sizes are down here. So 84 territories in the Mojave, 13 Great Basin, and 3 in the Tahoe Basin. And this simply shows you, in terms of kilometers, your average distance from the nearest permanent water source. And that could be things like a big lake, or it could be, standing pond or river, stream, you name it. And so we measured these all from the territory center to the nearest body of water. Mojave Desert, roughly a little over 7 kilometers away on average. Great Basin bounced up to around 14 kilometers away on average again, but extending all the way out. And what's critical, I forgot to mention this, is how far out. We're picking up territories and confirming territories almost 50 kilometers from the nearest water source. So you know that I spent those first 6 years or so down south in the Lake Mead area. Well, inherently, the recreation area, it surrounds both Lakes Mead and Mojave. It's about 700,000 acres, I think, when including the lakes and the surrounding land. But inherently, it's fairly biased because you are close to water. So I wanted to break those out, and that's what I'm showing you here. So when you break away the Lake Mead territories, which there's 42 of them, you compare that with the other 42 out also in the Mojave, but these are what I would call arid land or kind of non-traditional peregrines. You see the dramatic difference. So in Lake Mead, on average, they're about 1 kilometer from water. Out elsewhere in the Mojave, it's up around 14 and 15 kilometers away, which is very similar to what we see in the Great Basin. So there's pretty strong overlap with how they use the landscape there. Tahoe Basin, we've only got 3 territories and they're close to water, so there's not much to say there. But this is pretty important because it really did flip. It was the first time from the years, basically 2007 through maybe 2012. These were the years that we were kind of flipping the script and realizing they were in a lot more places that people hadn't been looking previously, which is pretty important. It also has some implications, as I'll get into here shortly, in terms of potential contaminants. So one thing that I've worked a lot with is mercury contamination. And mercury it's a naturally occurring heavy metal. It's detrimental to all living organisms that we are aware of. We don't know a toxic effects threshold for peregrines, but we know it's also not beneficial. But it tends to methylate and accumulate in aquatic systems and also organisms and wildlife that live there and use those systems. So there's some potential implications there, and that, just think about that in Lake Mead versus elsewhere. But also avian flu, that's another critical thing that a lot of you might be seeing in the news. It especially and particularly hits our waterfowl and our aquatic birds, things like grebes, gulls, terns, and that nature, all of which peregrines like to eat. So it has some potential impacts there just to think about. This distance to water, how might that drive how well peregrines do on the landscape? So that's what I'm going to show you here. So one portion of my dietary data set is just focusing on prey attempts. And that I only used the prey attempts where I could absolutely confirm I watched the attempt from start to finish. I didn't want to bias things towards successful attempts. So if you happen to be out there stomping around and you look, and this has certainly happened, but lo and behold, they catch a coot, an American coot. Well, if you didn't see it from start to finish, you don't know how many times they would have attempted and you missed, you just didn't see it. And so my total sample size is, I want to do math real quick, 126 plus 41, so 167 prey attempts. And I broke that down near water versus far from water. My cutoff was actually 640 meters, which again, this is the fastest animal on the planet. They can cover 640 meters pretty quickly. But, this is a Joe Barnes or human contrived cutoff, really. what I did at the time, I was down at Lake Mead, and I looked at the 75th percentile. So 75% of our nests or our territories were all within 640 meters of the water. And then there would seem to be a natural break where then you didn't see territories for a long time, and then you did beyond, further out to 9 kilometers, I guess. And so that's how I broke it down. I wanted to see if they were making a living any differently, and if that might impact adult survival or breeding success. And so what I'll show you here, one portion of this is what do they target? And I'm just kind of lumping and pooling. I'll get later into the details of the gory details of what they eat. But for now, we're just gonna simply say aquatic birds versus all others. Well, those peregrines that are close to water, almost 50% of their diet was aquatic birds, about almost three times as great of a percentage or proportion as we see from those territories nesting far from water. And even far is still fairly close in terms of peregrine, but you do see, as with most organisms, they want to minimize calorie expenditure. So if you don't have to fly 3 miles to get a meal, you won't, and so you'll stay closer to your nest and pick up aquatic birds. That also is important because then when you look at overall average prey mass, and so I broke down these animals here. This isn't just a general average, but this is just those organisms that I saw peregrines capture, or at least attempt to capture. On average, they're 3 times heavier for those peregrines that are closer to water. And so that's pretty important because that translates directly into calorie intake for the individual that's capturing it, as well as its mate, and as well as the offspring. So then how might that play into breeding success? So how might that influence how well peregrines do? Well, again, now I'm looking at the years 2006 through 2010, so I truncated a little bit based on the best observational data I had for breeding success. So I monitored 93 different breeding attempts. I broke them down the same way, near versus far at 640 meters, and you see how it plays out in terms of breeding success. So those territories that are near water, 0.81 or 81% of the time, they were successful, which means for each breeding attempt that year, at least one young successfully fledged the nest and flew off, survived. And if you compare that to the territories far from water, which again is only beyond 640 meters, it was half of that. So 42% of those were successful. And if you look at the average number of young per attempt, it went from 2.1 to, again, less than half at 0.9 young per attempt at territories far from water. Another key thing, and one way to think about overall population health, is breeding density. And a key way that most, an awful lot of raptor researchers, the way you try to get a handle of this with this is looking at your average nearest neighbor distance. That's just simply because it's a territorial bird, they're going to fight and defend their territory. There are things that certainly play out. So nest substrate availability is critical. You need nests nearby, but prey availability is very critical. So in areas where prey is abundant, you can pack in tighter because you don't need to defend as great of a space in order to feed yourself and your young. So if you break out the Lake Mead National Recreation sites, those 42 territories, on average, about 5.51 kilometers between adjacent neighboring territories. In terms of miles, sorry, I know a lot of you probably don't think in metrics, but in terms of miles, that's about 3.2, 3.3 miles. The minimum was 1.5 kilometers, which is about 3/4 of a mile away. So pretty tight, and this is down in the Lake Mead area. If you broaden that view and look a little bit further out to the rest of the Mojave Desert, not so dense, but still not bad. A little over 10.6 kilometers on average between neighboring territories. If you jump out to the Great Basin, there are far fewer of those territories, but they are really spread out. So we've got almost 41 kilometers on average between adjacent territories. And that ranged up to 133 kilometers. So some of these birds and some of these breeding pairs are really isolated from one another. Okay, so I want to just kind of spell out and show you how this kind of evolved over time. What I'm going to show you on the maps, I'll have a series of slides. Each one has a date. I'm going to start with 2004. I told you when I started, we had a total of 16 territories. We picked up 3 more this year. So these are the results by the end of that that season, the breeding season. And simply on the graph to the right, this is just breaking it down by year, total number of known nesting territories. And you see this big red vertical line, that's just simply showing the snapshot of where we're looking and when we're looking. And so the blue bars there, that is number of territories that are that were not occupied, but number of territories that were known and existed in the Mojave Desert. Red is Central Basin Range, which would be Great Basin, and then green, the Sierra Nevada or the Tahoe Basin area. So you look at 2004 and you see the distribution of those territories. Jump forward to 2010, which was the last year of my intensive work down at Lake Mead. We were up to 63 territories, pretty big jump. I do want to note, sorry, I should have said this much earlier, but when I'm talking about total territories, this also includes a handful or a couple handfuls of birds that are just over state lines, mostly in Arizona, down at Lake Mead, where they're just over the Arizona border. So it is a little bit, you could shave off in total maybe 10 to 15 territories, but most of these essentially are Nevada birds. And then by 2024, which there are actually 2 different territories that are missing that were picked up later, and I forgot to add them here, but we're up to now 101 territories. Pretty impressive expansion, and you see how not only did they radiate out into the Mojave Desert, but also up into Great Basin. And so not too bad. And when you're out there conducting these surveys over a 20-year period or so, it really seemed to be, as I was doing it, it's like, wow, these birds are locally, they're pushing out. They're in some form or fashion. The stronghold seems to be Southern Nevada, and they're radiating out to the north and to the west. I wasn't really content with that answer, though, and so I worked with a good friend of mine and collaborated with Dr. Brian Siegel and his group of students down with Nevada State University in the Henderson, Las Vegas area. We also are collaborating with Dr. Zika Glucks and her students in the Santa Cruz Predatory Bird Research Group to get an idea about population structure and try to let that inform what was going on as far as what we think of with the expansion, the population expansion. So we got 64 samples from Nevada birds, Nevada peregrines, 72 from coastal California peregrines. And I will note, these are feather samples, so as minimally invasive as we could get. We're not taking blood, we're not taking other tissues, we're just simply taking feathers, that's all we want, and running the analyses. I'm not a geneticist, I'm not gonna go into this, I'm just gonna give you some rough results. But what we did is we used some microsatellite analyses of 12 different microsatellite sites. We also did an analysis of genotyping by sequence, to analyze the single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. And so that's a way to quantify genetic relatedness. And then the raw data, this is messy, I'll walk you through it. So here's a principal components analysis that you see on the right. And I have them kind of roughly color-coded. So Mojave Desert, arid territories, so those away from Lake Mead, are in kind of this reddish orange, which is this circle. And I will say these circles, they denote where the territories, where the samples came from. So we have them clustered, and how big and what, how those circles are oriented will tell you about how closely related individuals within that population are. So again, towards the center of the graph, we've got these Mojave Desert birds. We have Great Basin in this kind of greenish circle that has very strong overlap. And then the Colorado River group extends out, again, pretty strong overlap, but it is a bit more expansive, potentially because there's actually a lot more of them. The take home here that I want to have you focus on is within this red circle, these are all of our Nevada samples. So almost complete exclusion from California, which you see in those, in the yellow circles over there to the right, or the yellow dots within those circles. Those are all our California birds. And so what this supports is that indeed it's an intrinsic or local population growth. So peregrines, the name peregrine, the word peregrine means pilgrim or wanderer. They can cover vast distances. They can, disperse great distances. So when seeing an expansion, you're never really sure, are they coming in from other states, other areas, or not? So this data really suggests that indeed it's a locally derived expansion. And so I don't have comparable data to analyze, say, Utah or Arizona, but the key thing here is that when you look at the data, those individuals that are most closely related to one another are also those individuals that are nearest to one another as far as territories on the landscape. So again, it does imply that you don't have a lot of immigration from elsewhere. And I have to throw this in here, I can't help myself. As researchers, we like to think we have a great study plan. We've got it all under control. We know what we don't know, or at least we think we know what we don't know, and then we want to learn what's going on. So this is just to kind of lighten it up. We aren't always in control. We're not always the winner. I'm out there trying to collect feathers so I can get some, do some innocent, genetic work. Peregrines don't always appreciate that. And so this is pretty much the most aggressive female that I've ever encountered. This is a mom, and she's honestly the best mom I've ever seen in my life. She was fighting to save her chicks, which she was convinced I was gonna try to kill. She stayed with me for easily 20 minutes. So I ended up we compromised. Instead of being able to grab samples from both chicks, I got one. But in the process, I would say I lost a whole lot more genetic material than that chick did. Yes, lots of blood that day, but it's very interesting. It makes for a good story, so. Okay, so most of that tends to, hey, we're changing the paradigm. Peregrines are nesting out in the open desert. That's cool. Peregrines are expanding in an area we previously didn't think they nested. That's pretty interesting. That's not the full picture, and I think the most critical part of it, especially today, is what's going on in this slide, and I'll walk you through here. So I went out, each of these bars, I'm looking at my survey effort over the years. On average, I checked 31.6, so let's round up to 32 territories a year. So it's not exceedingly small sample size. Even at the high point of the population, I'm surveying maybe about a third of the territories. On it, that ranged from 16 to 40 to 45 territories a year. So the blue bars here is each year, it's 0 to 1 in terms of proportion of occupants that were occupied. So just think also 0 to 100, so 100% versus none. In those this is showing the blue bars are Lake Mead, kind of those what I previously been calling like traditional sites. Red bars are elsewhere, which includes elsewhere in the Mojave, but also across the Great Basin and even Tahoe area. And so in this black line, this is the trend line just for the Lake Mead National Recreation Area. This is preliminary data. I'm not going to show you any statistics. It's pretty clear to see there's a decline. I want to walk you through a couple, really important periods of this though. First is right out of the gates. Again, those first 2 years, 2004 and 2005, I was getting my feet and I didn't have I'll admit, I didn't have the most awesome breeding data or occupancy data. So I kind of truncated that off. I will say, actually, those first 2 years, they were all occupied, but anyways. So from 2006 to 2010, so a 5-year period, I looked at 145 different breeding attempts or territories, so we'll call them territory years. 95% of them were occupied. That was in a couple years, it was 100%. Now you jump forward to the next kind of big focal period. I missed a couple years in there. Partly that was me changing jobs and changing priorities. But from 2015 through 2018, we see this. And again, the data is pooled here. So I looked at 174 territory years and I found 79% occupancy. It was a decline, but other than 2016, I wasn't alarmed. I will admit, and Brian Siegel, collaborator, he's heard me, I got a little squeamish and I was a little alarmed in 2016. This is Lake Mead, and Lake Mead alone, it suddenly dropped from where I used to see nearly 100% occupancy, now they're down to 60. So I was a little bit alarmed, but then the very next year, they bounced up over 80%, and I thought, well, okay, fine. It's an expanding population. Maybe they hit their carrying capacity. There's some leveling off or plateauing. Not too alarming. I do have a huge data gap, of which I'm pretty regretful for, but I can't go back in time. So I don't know what's going on from 2019 to 2023. I was actually doing peregrine work all of those years. I was banding, I was taking genetic samples, mercury samples, but I didn't have the resources. I wasn't doing comprehensive occupancy on a broad scale. Not until last year and this year, so 2024 and 2025, did I do that. And I found much more alarming, if you pull that data, 72 different territory years, on average, it was 51% occupancy. In Lake Mead area was far worse, down 44%. And actually one of the years, I think it was 40% this year. And again, now this means a couple different things. First, remember, peregrines are territorial. And with other territorial raptors, you typically have a non-breeding adult floater population. These birds are, for whatever reason, they haven't found or maintained a territory, but what they do is they act as a population regulator, basically a check valve. So when you have vacancies, they will come in and replace male or female. So one way to think about if you know that you've got a healthy raptor population is if you have turnover of individuals and they're actually truly replaced and you don't lose a whole ton of them. But when you have big drops, and when those drops are sustained over time, you've got a big problem. Because they're highly territorial, they will defend their territory tooth and nail. I mean, extremely rarely will you have one individual move from one territory to the next. For the most part, it does happen, but not that often. For the most part, when you have individuals leave territories, it's because they've died. So when you think about a now 50% occupancy, that means you've lost 50% of your breeding population, which is fairly substantial. And I would argue it's even worse because there's been no rebound. I don't know what was going on in these years, but we had 2 consecutive years of extreme low occupancy. That is telling me that our floater population either is non-existent or greatly depleted. There's a problem. And so honestly, I think, and oftentimes that floater population can be up to 3 or 4 times as great as your breeding population. So we potentially have an issue here, I would say. We don't know where it's going to turn up, how it's going to turn out. A couple things I want to note though. Remember Lake Mead and how close they nest to water. That's pretty critical. And also what they feed on, which is aquatic birds. So 2 pieces there is one, I'll get into some slides here in a second, looking at mercury contaminants. Well, guess what? There's pretty high mercury contamination of aquatic birds down in the Lake Mead area. And also actually elsewhere in Nevada, as long as you're close to an aquatic source, there's actually most of those aquatic birds are going to have some level of mercury contamination. Not only the prey, but also the peregrines themselves. So also avian flu, which is pretty critical. And that year 2016, I was alarmed, but I didn't really piece it together. I didn't know what I was looking for. But 2015 was a year that a particularly virulent strain of avian flu hit North America. So the first year that it could have manifested itself on the peregrine population was that next year, 2016. We did have a pretty good, healthy rebound after that, reasonably, which was encouraging. But that's interesting. It's circumstantial, but it's interesting. And then if you follow that up with more recently, in 2022, we have the H5N1 strain, which is still out there. It's a lot of times these avian flu strains will hit and they'll kind of roll through, and then you might not have it, for a number of years, or it's somewhere else in the globe. But this H5N1 has stayed, and it's even as of actually 2 days ago, I've got reports of hundreds of dead aquatic birds, waterfowl in Nevada in some of our lakes. So it's still out there, and I think it's circumstantial at this point, but honestly, I think it's probably one of the biggest bellwethers of what's going on here. Okay, so mercury. Again, sorry, these are all difficult slides, but I'll walk you through this. So again, I'm looking at feathers, just as we did with genetics. I sampled 120 peregrines from 23 different territories for this data. I've since, this was published back in 2015, I've since probably sampled at least 50 more. The results are all very similar. But to break it down first, the blue bars are the traditional, mostly Lake Mead, but not in all cases. But it's mostly those traditional water peregrines that are close to water. And I compare that to red bars, those are those arid land peregrines, or those far from water. So your contaminant load of mercury is 3 to almost 5 times greater in adults close to water versus far from water. You do the same comparison of nestlings. Now, this is also interesting in that nestlings you sample when they're 3 to 4 weeks old. So they have not been on this earth very long. And already those peregrines, especially those that are close to water, have extremely high, in a relative sense, I shouldn't say extreme, but fairly high mercury levels. And it's basically 3 to 4 times greater than we see in arid systems. And then if I jump over to the Great Basin, focusing only on nestlings, unfortunately, I just haven't sampled that many adults from either the Great Basin or the Sierra Nevada. So the best data set that I have are nestlings up in the Great Basin, and you see a very similar pattern to what we saw in the Mojave Desert. Again, it's not that we have that much water up there, but where we do have it, those peregrines tend to be far more contaminated than their arid or desert brethren. Another way to look at that is, so peregrines do a very nice thing for me, is they pluck the prey. So mostly they're catching birds, they're bringing it back to the nests, and they're plucking the prey. So when you go into band nestlings, you can retrieve the scraps, identify it to species, and then in this case, since mercury is deposited in feathers when feathers grow, you can actually use that, the concentration of mercury in the feathers as an index of relative exposure. So if we break it down in terms of aquatic bird mercury content, so these are your things like, ducks, geese, gulls, terns, coots, grebes, things of that nature. If you look at those birds, and these were actual birds that were consumed by peregrines, and I didn't just sample the landscape, I actually sampled what they ate. The sample sizes are down here. I will admit it's extremely low sample size. Don't hold that against me, but it's hard to find aquatic birds in the open desert for myself and for peregrines, but it's just tough to get a sample size there. So again, over 5 times greater, almost 6 times greater mercury content or concentration in those aquatic birds that were in Lake Mead, and also the ones close to water. If you look at terrestrial birds, so this is things like doves, swifts, swallows, your passerines, your songbirds, as well as quail in some cases. Sample size, again, we have a pretty robust sample size there. Mercury levels close to water are much lower than we saw in aquatic birds close to water, but actually significantly greater than terrestrial birds out in the open desert. A bit of that has to do with its different species in the open desert compared to those that are close to water. But I believe some of that possibly is being driven by terrestrial birds, your songbirds, your warblers, and blackbirds especially, taking insects that may be hatched from or spend a significant amount of time on the water bodies. So that is a little bit more speculative, but the signature is there. Again, the overall take home is that the closer to water, the more contaminated you tend to be. So that first cut of looking at diet, that was looking at kind of an arbitrary 640 meters. I will say this is also semi-arbitrary, I'll be honest, but I broke it down. I wanted to look a little bit broader. So remember, in the Mojave especially, nearest neighbor distance was a little over 5 kilometers, which is a little bit more reasonable in terms of how far a peregrine is going to travel to potentially acquire food. And so this data set is not just looking at the prey attempts, but it's actually looking at the combined collection of those prey remains that I mentioned for the mercury. So sample size here for Mojave Desert compared to Great Basin Desert. And now we're looking the near water, I've changed. So now I'm looking between 0 and 3 kilometers away. And this is just a very coarse breakdown by prey type. Blue is aquatic birds. So they still take quite a few terrestrial, although in terms of biomass, because again, those aquatic birds are far heavier, definitely when you're closer to water, the overall terms of calorie intake is definitely skewed heavily towards aquatic birds. But it gives you a decent idea of how they use the landscape and what prey types they're looking for, and especially in relation to that mercury data. And then if you look further out, so now we're looking far from water. Those are territories that are 3 to 10 kilometers away. By far and away, down in the Mojave, you still, the percentage or the proportion of aquatic birds shrinks fairly dramatically, but it's still somewhat robust. In the Great Basin, it's, almost negligible. I think part of that is there's just some, random springs and seeps and things like that in the Mojave Desert are much more of a magnet for birds, I think, because it's that much more of an extreme environment. That's a little more theoretical, but I just wanted to kind of just show you how the actual diet does change on the landscape, and that can have some impacts in terms of mercury contamination. So now the rest of the talk is just going to talk about what they eat and how they eat. So I have, over the entirety of this whole project, I've been combining prey observations with collection of prey remains. And this is just an example of one haul. So one nest, when I went in to go band nestlings, this is the type of scraps you find. In this case, it was an unfortunate long-billed curlew. But I'm able to grab all these feathers, bring it back, and actually a collaborator, John Schmidt, he's an amazing resource. He did an awful lot, the vast majority of my analyses of these feathers. These are hard to go through. So But in the process of these two data sources, I was able to come up with 117 different species of prey in Nevada alone, over 1,100 individuals. And that breaks down, I break it down here by Mojave Desert, Great Basin, and Sierra Nevada. Don't want to scare you, but here's a pie graph of what that looks like. So it's just, and this is just, the legend isn't inclusive. It's alphabetical. I couldn't fit any more in there. It goes down to green-winged teal, or I think. So this is just, it gives you an idea of how diverse their diet is. I mean, they are taking ton of birds, and basically from a hummingbird, I do have one Anna's hummingbird that was prey, all the way up to cackling or Canada goose. That was the largest, and double-crested cormorant as well. Those, both of which are far larger, far heavier than a peregrine. So this gives you an idea of their dietary breadth. It's massive, it's huge. They're opportunistic in a large degree, but they can also really hone in and specialize when there's abundant prey source. One of the biggest pieces of this pie, this is for eared grebes in blue here. So that's primarily driven by those peregrines, especially down by Lake Mead, really focus on eared grebes. It also happens to be that eared grebes were far and away not even comparable. They were the far most contaminated species in terms of mercury load. This other big pink wedge, you're kind of looking at that and wondering about it. Most of that is my observational data where I knew they were going after, say, it's a songbird of some nature. In some cases, it's either Western kingbird versus castor. They're like, I didn't really know. So this pink is for the most part, songbird unidentified, but still gives you an idea.
Yeah.
And now to the list. I know you guys love birds, so I don't want to make you sad if your favorite bird is up here. But this is the 7 most predominant species that peregrines have taken. Those 4, there are those unfortunate ones. They're all in these red borders. But basically, eared grebes, mourning doves, great-tailed grackles. A lot of that's from the south. Part of this would change if I could get more samples from the Great Basin and also Sierra region. And part of that is there are fewer territories, and I have also been looking fewer years in those areas, but I try. Down to, bats, certainly multiple species of bats. It's sizable. They're, the 5th most consumed prey type. Pigeons and white-throated swifts. Birds themselves constitute almost 96% of the diet. And then you've got those bats, 3.4%. And then there's some really weird ones. There was a single fish in one nest, a carp, small one. I had a lizard. I had a small rodent, undetermined what species. So yeah, a couple weird novelty species, but for the most part, birds. Another thing, here's peregrines, fastest animal on the planet, aggressive, charismatic, wham bam, there's top of the line, avian predator, apex predator. Well, you see, they're not always successful. So what I want to do is just kind of show you just a snapshot of that. So in terms of prey attempts and whether or not they're successful, that's what I'm showing you here. So the overall average success rate, and again, this is that same data set. So in this case, my sample size is 217 observations. I was not always able to determine exactly what species they were going after, but all 217, I can absolutely confirm I saw start to finish of all prey attempts. So I knew whether or not they were successful. If I didn't know, and it certainly happened, easily double that number, are times where I either looked too late or I lost them because they were going too fast and I couldn't tell if they were successful or not. But if I only truncate it to the data that I'm absolutely certain about, we've got less than 30%, actually about 28% of the time they're successful. So it gives you an idea. They are a top of the line predator, but it doesn't always go their way. I did try to they do hunt tandemly, especially on territory when you've got male and female during the breeding season, which is fascinating to watch. Highly recommend it if you guys can see it. It's incredible to watch those male, they hunt totally different when they're going after, say, phalaropes versus a songbird or a white-throated swift, or even ducks, green-winged teal. It's totally different hunting strategies. It's pretty fascinating. I will say, tandem, it is interesting to think about evolutionarily. It didn't really infer a huge amount of additional hunting success. It was sample sizes here, on the side, so 42 attempts, not huge, but still it tells you something. But, statistically it might not be significant, but on average, males were a little more successful than females, and then tandem kind of fit in the middle. And one last piece, and I don't even know what to make of this, but I can't help it. This graph is still showing the same data. This is the average mass. So in cases when I could identify species, or species group, so the Cassins versus Western kingbird, I know you can look up their average mass. And so what I would do is I assign that, look at who was taken at male versus female or attempting it versus tandem. And so interestingly enough, in all cases, they attempt to catch more larger prey than they actually do catch. And they certainly catch big things, but on average, this gives you an indication for the blue lines are their attempts, the orange or reddish lines are successful captures. And again, sample sizes are down here. So females, it is interesting. I mean, they really go for big things, but they're not that successful. So, and it's, I mean, there's part of the explanation is this data actually derives from my Lake Mead days. So most of this is focused around water, and females during incubation and brooding, especially when nestlings are young, they are really around the nest site. And so those nest sites are inherently close to water. So what happened a lot was females would take a pot shot at, at a coot, at a grebe, at a, shoot, at a cinnamon teal. And so they weren't always successful, but they really had a high target. They were happy to see what they could get. Kind of interesting. And that's all. Sorry, hopefully I haven't rambled too much. Quick summary. Awesome, it was amazing. It was amazing to be part of this. It's ongoing and evolving. I don't know how the story's gonna end, but 16 up to 101 territories was pretty incredible to be part of and be able to help document. This expansion and increased breeding population based on what we see on the landscape, but more fundamentally and more critically based on the genetic data is a locally fueled expansion. There has been. However, to temper that, we've shown widespread mercury contamination. In fact, I've actually tested hundreds more peregrines. I've done collaborative work with folks in Washington State, as well as I've tested peregrines from northern, like North Slope of Alaska all the way to Greenland. I've never once found a peregrine without mercury contamination. And our birds here in Nevada, they are less than marine coastal peregrines on say the Pacific coast, but they're have significantly greater mercury contents than elsewhere in the continent that I've been able to find. So, very strong annual territorial occupancy early on. I mean, I was astounded. Everywhere you looked, you just found them. And from especially 2004 through 2010, it was wonderful. However, these last couple of years is kind of gruesome. Going out there and 50% occupancy is not a good picture. I will say in Lake Mead area, those peregrines that are close to water, they're taking it by far the hardest. So that's a little certainly disappointing. We've got almost a 56% decline at this point, and it hasn't leveled off. I mean, it might. I don't know what's going to happen this coming year, but that line is still going down, and we don't know where it's gonna land. I don't want to be too much of a downer, though. I mean, we still went from 16 territories, even if you assume 50%. 16 versus 50. It's not awful, but it's reason for concern. And again, it seems to be HPI, so highly pathogenic avian influenza, not just here, but globally. We've seen multiple populations are being hit this way, and very similar levels of decline, anywhere from 40 to 60 or even up to 70% declines globally. With that contact information, I'll leave that on the next slide as well. Again, I could not do this. You can't pull off a 22-year data set on your own. I've benefited from a lot of good mentors and agency support, as well as really awesome people helping with analyses and helping with fieldwork. So thank all of those folks. And I will take questions if we have time.
I had a question. I was amazed and shocked too about the common raven that they catch. Was it a lot of them or just like one off or?
No, I think the ravens, I might have single digits, so 3 maybe. One was for sure either a very recently fledged one or a very old nestling. It still had sheaths on all of its flight feathers and tail feathers. So that was either right out of the nest or immediately after it left the nest. The parents, I will say, were not pleased whatsoever. So we had a female peregrine consuming it when I arrived. And the parent, the adult ravens were upset, as you can imagine, they're very vocal. But yeah, it's been a handful of times, or, I would say maximum, say 3 to 5 instances. But it does
That's pretty
happen.
cool.
Yeah.
So as Lake Mead has dropped in level, does that increase the level of mercury around that area for the birds? And other areas with the drop that occurs?
I don't think so.
I wonder if there's a core.
The amount of mercury, I don't think it's concentrating because it is a flow through system. And Mead is, John, you might know this, but like it's the water in Lake Mead is replaced pretty
Yeah, it's a
rapidly.
pretty high turnover rate.
Yeah, pretty high.
Although probably less now.
Yeah.
Given flow reductions in the system overall,
Mhm.
but it's not stagnant.
Yeah, I would say absolutely yes for something like Walker Lake or Pyramid or something like that, like those endorheic systems that are just concentrating stuff, but Mead, I wouldn't. And, there is a study showing basically like leaching out mercury along the Colorado Plateau, up in the Canyonlands and elsewhere in like, southern and eastern Utah. So basically some of the drainage of the Colorado River. There's been at least one study that I'm aware of mercury leaching out from bedrock, basically. So there's definitely mercury in the system, but I think the biggest contributing factor here is actually external. So it's migratory birds that are picking up mercury elsewhere. I mentioned the eared grebes. So by far and away, they were not only are they the biggest prey component, but they're also very much so the most contaminated species. It just so happens that, and I used to know these numbers, I forget now, but it's something like 90% of the North American population does a molt migration stopover on the Great Salt Lake before they head down basically to the Lake Mead area. And they'll drop their flight feathers, they're flightless, they're feeding on brine shrimp, brine flies. Great Salt Lake is one of the, if not the most heavily contaminated bodies of water in North America for mercury. So I think, and I spent a little bit of time, not a lot, but a little bit of time up in Utah, working with Hawkwatch. And we had a die-off of grebes. And so I ran out there, this would have been in 2013 or so. I was sad, but happy. And I'd already been doing a couple years of mercury work. And so we had just dead grebes everywhere, mostly from not from mercury, but disease. It was a disease outbreak. And so I went out and sampled, and I not only, so I have a bunch of ear grebe samples from Nevada, but then I have that subset, of which I think I sampled at least 30 to 40 grebes from Great Salt Lake. They were all extremely high. So, what I think is it's basically a conveyor belt of migratory birds picking it up elsewhere. It's not a known, like in John, pick on you because you're a fish guy, but.
It's not a fish issue, and if it's not a fish issue, it's not gonna bioaccumulate.
Yeah.
Up through that food
Yeah.
chain, even with other birds,
Yeah.
that are then secondarily consumed.
Yeah, I think Lakes Mead and Mojave, they're a huge magnet for birds because they're in this harsh desert environment. Migratory pathways is a stopover for sure. And those birds are coming from elsewhere, both from the south going up and from the north coming down on fall migration. So I truly think it's more of like a conveyor belt type scenario where contaminated birds are bringing it to the peregrines.
Wow, yeah.
It's interesting that mercury itself, so elemental mercury is not bioavailable, and so it has to methylate before it can work its way up the food chain.
Mhm.
So, it's an interesting question about Lake Mead, because as it's lower in height, water height, some of those areas, particularly the upper arm, the overhead arm, some of those substrates might be more.
Yeah,
more
there's
available.
mud flats,
Particularly for
yeah,
grapes.
some of that could,
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's possible.
and weeds are,
possible.
they're a ooze-eating critter.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
And there's some nasty stuff in Las Vegas wash.
Yeah.
But I don't think we've seen a significant downstream transport issue. So yeah, birds that are localized in areas of Las Vegas wash, for example, that might be prey items for peregrines could have some issues, but it's not a really widespread significant
Interesting question.
problem.
Yeah.
But interesting though.
I don't know.
yeah. Now, oh yeah,
So the early studies showed peregrines up north like around Pyramid Lake and Ruby, what happened to them and can they reoccupy those areas potentially?
They could, and they even possibly have. I mean, I haven't been able to look closely in those areas. They certainly could. There's no reason why they can't reoccupy. I mean, the belief is that was the era when they blinked out was the early to mid 1950s. Population was plummeting. So California by the early 70s they were down to, I believe, just 2 remaining territories for the entire state. They lost like 98% of their population. Every peregrine east of the Mississippi was gone. So the whole half of the continent was depopulated and emptied out. Most states in the West had suffered, 70+% declines. So it was right in that same era. So presumably it was after, it was impacts from DDT. Yeah. But as far as like coming back, then once they've been gone, especially once you're gone for 3 decades, and those are pretty isolated areas. It is going to take a little bit of time, and it is possible they're out there. Like I'm not out there, surveying every year. It's hard to get there from here, and I just don't have the time. But it is possible they're out there. I doubt if they've been there super long because people probably would start noticing. And
It wasn't one of the hack sites they tried when they tried the reintroduction program.
Yeah, they
were
tried.
unsuccessful, yeah.
It was unsuccessful. Yeah, one of the reintroduction locations was out by Ruby Lake, Ruby Marshes area to the stick.
So what effect does mercury have on the bird?
So mercury, yeah, just didn't have time to get into that. Mercury is not good for any living organism really, but where its toxic effects thresholds are is highly variable. So for birds, it's very widespread. There's the Carolina wrens and some birds in Europe. There's actually been some really good, elegant studies that show impact to breeding, like actually quantifiable, reductions of fecundity at 3 parts per million. Ours and like our highest peregrines, I think we're up in the low 40s, maybe 42 parts per million, which is pretty high. But our overall average for adults close to water is, I believe, roughly 16 to 18 parts per million. So well above what's been demonstrated. Between 3 and 7 parts per million has been a big problem for some songbirds. For reproduction and it's harder to quantify survival because there's other factors going on. But you can look at breeding success, and it's been demonstrated. For some other species like common loons, people have looked at mercury in common loons for a long time, especially in the Northeast and in the Midwestern states. So there is a pretty good idea when you start having population level impacts, and that's up in the 20 to 30 part per million range. But every species kind of handles methylated mercury a little bit differently. And I will say the reason why I can actually go out there and test feathers is because every single time, all birds molt. And so every time they drop their feathers and regrow them, it's essentially acting like a third kidney. So when you analyze the feathers, that's actually already been removed from their bloodstream. That's essentially been scrubbed out of the organism. Some of the data that I didn't have time to go into is for some of those other data sets, especially my work in Washington, myself and collaborators, we had some individuals up to 6 recaptures over like a 12-year span that in one bird. And so it was interesting. So they don't just keep getting more and more and more mercury. They actually plateau usually in their 2nd to 4th year of life. And 2 things happen there. So one is the feather replacement. It's like a third kidney. You're actually scrubbing out mercury each time that you replace feathers and regrow them. So when I'm testing, the results that I'm showing here is not actually how much is in the body at that moment. It's basically a relative index of their exposure. The good thing about peregrines is they have an extremely reliable molt cycle. So if you collect the first feather that's dropped or replaced, which is then regrown, that's a good way, especially when you're catching older birds, or if you're catching the same bird multiple times over a period of years, you can look at relative change. If you just grab a random feather, you don't always, it can change based on where it lies in the molt. So on their, if you look at their wing, their 4th primary feather is actually the first one to drop, or the 4th or 5th secondary. So if you get one of those 2 feathers, it's a really good kind of elegant way to standardize things over time. So that's part of your question. I forget, now I forget the
So I
whole.
think neurologically it affects.
Oh, how does it? Yes, so neurologic, yes, thanks, Roy. Yeah, so neurological and, certainly impacts, cognitive ability. Humans, there's actually unfortunately a fair amount of studies, especially with indigenous folks worldwide. Definitely impacts humans neurologically. Endocrine system is impacted with humans and birds. And so it's that type of thing. And when you're a bird that needs to be in high precision, you're already only successful less than 30% of the time. But if you're not functioning, you're not symmetrical or coordinated in your attack, you're not gonna be able to feed yourself, so.
So that begs the question, groups are the highest level of mercury. Are they selecting for groups who are less functional and able to escape? Because groups' normal way of escaping is to dive. And if they're neurologically impacted, are they more easily prey species becoming a prey
Yeah, I
species?
mean, you could easily say that across the board, that basically the birds that they're catching are the more contaminated. So there have been studies in multiple species, including some gulls and terns, showing, some of that impairment of flight capability. And so it's quite possible, everything matters when you're flying 180 miles an hour. And the one that you happen to, if you're in a flock, and the one that dives a little slower, or the one that takes off and that isn't able to go quite as fast or turn quite as quickly, you get it. Whether it's mercury, or whether it's got avian flu, or whether it's got any other, impairment. And that's why like injured birds and also like oddities, unfortunately, like we all get excited when like there's on the bird listserv when there's a super cool bird. Peregrines are like doing that same thing. They don't have a network, but as soon as they see something that stands out, it's a potential vulnerability. And it's flashy, it catches their eye and they go for it. So yeah, like anything that makes you different is a vulnerability, really. And so because of that, that's what like my data on the prey, I don't want that to say like, overall, I know this about, grebes, their contaminant level. I probably did say that. I didn't mean it to say it quite that way. But basically, I don't know what the population level is. I just know of those that the peregrines are capturing, this is what we've got. And this is what they're.
Hey, Joe, we've got a bunch of questions on Zoom. I don't want people online to think we're
Yep.
ignoring them here.
Sorry.
So this one's,
Those people.
this one's a little wordy. I don't know if you want to try to pull it up there to read it. I'll read it out, but I might need to repeat myself, so. Jeep Pagel, I think I'm pronouncing that right, but
Yes.
recognizing your other duties and family endeavors, which ultimately can reduce your time afield, have you observed more peregrine subadults occupying territories in recent years? This thought moves back to the Moffat's equilibrium as posited by Granger Hunt. For my fieldwork, we found about 10% per year subadults during an increasing population in the 80s through the early 2000s. It keeps going. I don't know
Yeah.
if you want to address some of that.
No,
before I-
and I'm glad. Thanks, Jeep, for chiming in. I know Jeep pretty well. He's great, and he's done amazing work. I will say I had a good handle on subadult presence. So basically, for all you guys, you can tell effectively. Certainly a hash-eared peregrine. There, plenty of the photos. I should have pointed that out, but their plumage is different. It's more shades of brown, vertical streaking on the belly and breast. Second year birds are pretty identifiable if you know what you're looking for. Once you get to third year sometimes, but for the most part, we usually lump them as hatch year, second year, and then third year and above after third year or after second year. So to Jeep's question, when you start getting second year birds holding territories or moving in on and breeding with, say, an adult or after second year individual, that's oftentimes an indication. If that number is increasing, that means there's kind of an issue. You're either an expanding population and there's a lot of vacant territories that young birds can then fill in, or you're potentially a declining population and you're losing your adults and they're getting filled by young birds. So to Jeep's question, the first part of my data set, I would say, and I don't have this off the tip of my head, but I certainly saw males get replaced, adult males get replaced by second year birds. That was in Lake Mead between up through 2010. I think my overall average of subadults was maybe a maximum 5%. So not real high. It was still an expanding population. I expected to see more actually, assuming because I kept getting more and more territories every year. these later years, what I've had to do, like all my occupancy, because I am trying to cover vast chunks of the state. I will say it's truly notable when I get a second year bird. And last year, I don't think I got any, or the 2025, they were all adults that I could confirm. But what I do in order to cover a lot of terrain, I will simply look at occupancy of a breeding territory. I won't always stick around to make sure I've got both male and female. So if the male shows up and he's really mad, like, oh, okay, if I get lucky and it's the pair, great, got adult, both adults or whatever. So I do skip out after I get a single individual, as long as it's territorial and obviously defending a site. So I can't really quantitatively answer for more recent years, which unfortunately would be very important information, but.
So his question keeps going. He first and foremost wants to make sure that you understand how fantastic he thinks you are.
Thank you, G.
So just to note, despite the pointy head scientist question, Joe is an amazing field ecologist, fantastic human, and just an overall outstanding human. Overall, kudos to Joe. He is amazing. The final question would be, how can the audience help raptor conservation, not just peregrines, but also golden eagles? He also supports the kudos to John Schmidt, an amazing human.
Awesome, I'll second that. John's awesome. Well, now he's making me blush. Honestly, well, I do, so currently, it is interesting. So peregrines have been a success story, which means it's exceedingly difficult to get funding. And we currently don't have any funding. So I'm a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We don't have funding at the moment. This recent downturn is pretty darn, recent times. Like no one really knew this until very recently. And it's hard to get our heads around like how big of an issue it is or might be. Is it temporary? Is it just, once and hopefully if the flu rolls through, will they be okay? And then, 10 years from now, we'll just say, oh, that was interesting. But I truly don't know. Right now, there's practically no funding for peregrine work. So it's mostly, I do spend a fair amount of weekends. To Jeep's point, I sometimes drag the kids and the family out with me. I am happy to have volunteers. It's a big state, so there's a lot of ground to cover. And so it's sometimes onerous for people to get dragged out or willingly go out. But I'm usually happy if I get, willing victims that can get dragged around the desert for sizable chunks of time. So I don't know. I think on my talk, I put my email up there. Feel free to reach out to me, or maybe we can blast it out. But in the presentation, it's I don't know if I want to say it. It's Joe Senrab. So JoeSenrab @gmail.com.
So I know you've done a lot of work with golden eagles too. Are we seeing a similar circumstance with the population decline in golden eagles?
I've got some
Or is that something-
I've got some plants out here. No, so Jeep knows this, Rory knows this. Well, I just told Rory an hour ago, but yeah, so I do an awful lot of eagle work. That actually is funded a little better. So golden eagle work is one of my other specialties. We just got a publication out a week or two ago. And yes, we've confirmed declining population across the state, statewide level in Nevada, but for different reasons. Totally different prey base, totally different pressures. They also have far larger territories, but based on transmitter data over the past 12 years, we are pretty confident, 98% sure that we've got a declining golden eagle population across the state. So there's a 2% chance they're dying. Future talk, yes.
Yeah.
I'm always happy to talk about these things. So yeah, I've done an awful lot of work with peregrines. I also work with ferruginous hawks, which I gave, some of you guys might be aware of that. I spoke with Lahontanna Audubon Society in the fall at some point. And I would be happy to speak to GBBO about some of my ferruginous work. But yeah, those are my three biggies, I would say, golden eagles. Of the three, I think ferruginous hawks are doing the best, but unless you look in northwestern Nevada, which they're doing awful.
Couple more questions from Zoom here, Joe.
Yep.
Kathy Schmidt wants to know if you found a breeding pair near Cave Lake State Park. She saw two in the cliffs when she was there last May, and she wonders if there are other Nevadans working with you.
Yeah, so Cave Lake, I've had reports of potential pairs, and I actually looked several years ago and broadcasted, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, and didn't get them. I've got an awesome biologist, I'm not sure if she's watching, but I make her blush. Mariah Collada, she's with Endow up in Ely, and she has given me some input on the Cave Lake area. But we haven't, nothing's confirmed out there that I know of. They certainly could be there, and I can thank you, Kathy, because I can put that on the list. And maybe if you live there in proximity or go out there, it would be nice to figure that out.
Well, we've got 2 more questions maybe we can cover before we end here. Paul Hurtado wondering about the highly pathogenic avian influenza. Wondering if there's any evidence that birds that survive an infection do or do not gain lasting immunity, and if so, if there's thoughts on the feasibility of someone coming up with a vaccine that could be administered to nesting birds, falconry birds, that kind of thing.
Excellent question. Thank you, Paul. So there has been a vaccine developed. I don't know exactly how well it'll work with peregrines or if it's been demonstrated to work with peregrines. It has worked magnificently with California condors a couple years ago. There were several of those birds died, which was pretty eye-opening considering how critically imperiled they are still. So there has been a vaccine, to my knowledge, and I was actually just talking with Zika over in California about this, Zika Glux. You have to administer it, I believe, at least twice, so you need a booster. It's exceedingly hard. Condors are a little easier. They're super smart birds, I'll give them that, but they bait them in, and that's how they detox them for lead and things like that. So you can get your hands on them semi-routinely. Peregrines are exceedingly hard, so getting a nestling is easy, but getting a nestling a second time before it fledges is not so easy. And then catching an adult once is not easy, but it's also not, it's doable. But catching that same bird a second time, catching the right bird, is going to be pretty tough. And it's certainly going to take a lot of time and money, at least manpower. And I don't know if I have that time, so I probably need some money to do it. But good question, Paul. I will say, I want to hit this point. So to my knowledge, I could be wrong, but to my knowledge, there's not been a documented case of a peregrine surviving avian flu. So that's not the case. So bald eagles, especially in the Midwest and eastern half of the country, got hit very, very heavily by avian flu. However, they did develop immunity. They have antibodies. And so if you go out, and the last study that I've seen for bald eagles is even free flying population, I believe at least 40% of them have antibodies for avian flu. To my knowledge, I didn't even think it registers as a percentage, but as far as like wild peregrines, there might have been some instances where you've got a documented case of antibodies in a live, healthy peregrine, but I think it's like single digits at best. So they don't seem to be developing immunity. For whatever reason, their immune system is not adapted. They haven't adjusted yet. I'm hoping that we get some, certainly, and that would maybe be the answer unless the strain just burns itself out some other way. But otherwise, at this point, I believe peregrines, to put it in a quick coverage, not only are they not surviving, but they're usually dying within 1 to at most 3 days later. So it's usually 1 to 2 days they're dead.
One more question from Zoom. Jennifer Dudek wondering about considering the abundance of American coots at Lake Mead, is it surprising that ear grebes are at the top of the prey list and coots didn't even make the highlights? Maybe coots way too much in comparison to the grebes?
No, they love coots too. So they didn't make the top 7, but I think they're in the top 10. They get coots as well. No, and coots don't tend to have very much mercury. I think it's based on diet. Coots mostly being herbivorous compared to grebes taking aquatic inverts and things like that, small fish. So yes, they do take coots. I don't know why.
Have you ever tasted a coot?
I have not. I have not. Should I?
Peregrines are smarter than you think.
What stinks of mud?
But I would say, yeah, to that,
Yeah.
honestly, coots probably are either number 8, 9, or 10. They're high, they're high on the list. They haven't been forgotten.
No neglect for the roots. All right, well, that's it for questions from online. So thanks everyone for joining us on Zoom, and catch us next time at our next webinar.
Yeah.
Find info on our website. Thanks all and good night.
Great.